Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Gallery and this talk and introduction to our current exhibition, Kehinde Wiley, The Prelude. My name is Christine Riding. I'm the head of the Curatorial Department and curator of British paintings here at the National Gallery, and throughout the lecture, Ali will be interpreting. You see on my left. So the project with Kehinde leads on, I think, very spectacularly from a project that was an exhibition at the Stephen Friedman Gallery in London in 2017 called In Search of the Miraculous, which I will talk a little bit more about during the lecture. It's a project of a six-screen film. I think it's the first time that Kehinde's worked on that kind of format, and equally 5 paintings. 2 of which respond in the first instance to Winslow Homer, an artist that Kehinde has been looking at for some years now, and also The Ship of Fools, a second version that responds to Hieronymus Bosch. But this project is the first time that Kehinde has been looking at the Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich. Now, when Kehinde responds to specific works of art, which indeed he's very much known for and celebrated for, it really is as a starting point rather than him doing a sort of 21st century version of what these artists were trying to achieve in the past. And what he's really looking at is trying to address the issue of absence and marginalization of many, many people across history in modern and contemporary times who have been left at the margins of art history, of art production, of the kind of portraits, subject paintings, and indeed now landscape that has formed part of the canon of Western art. And Kehinde, when he's interviewed, talks about the tremendous power that museums and galleries have in establishing who is seen, who is on the walls of institutions such as ours. And he is looking to address and redress that imbalance, that marginalization, that absence that he feels has really been a stain, as it were, on the visual culture in particular. And obviously the National Gallery is at the heart of that over the centuries. Now, in the past, Kehinde has looked very particularly at portraiture, at history painting. He has looked at this through medium, most famously works on canvas and linen. He has also diverged into sculpture, into stained glass, into miniature forms of works of art, particularly after an artist called Memling. But here, I think the departure or the development in his practice really is to focus on landscape, the very powerful, very resonant, very much associated with empire, colonization, national identity, the genre that particularly in terms of seascapes and ocean imagery, of course, is linked to the idea of maritime and naval power, but of course during the 17th, 18th and into the 19th century associated with the transatlantic slave trade. So Kehinde's project really from the get-go in terms of him as an artist, he first started exhibiting in 2001, is now, as you say, a mid-career artist, largely focused in North America, but also doing global projects. This is one of the first of the major projects that he's actually sort of collaborated with a British institution, is that he is looking to represent not just, as I said, those who have remained absent over the centuries and marginalized over the centuries, but also look at the idea of the global and what that means in the 21st century. And it is by no means an accident that the people who are represented in the project at the National Gallery were cast in Haiti, Senegal, and London. That is 3 continents represented: North America, Europe, and Africa. The 3 continents, of course, that represent the transatlantic slave trade, and for Kehinde, of course, the legacy and the history of the African diaspora. So the title of the exhibition, The Prelude, looks to the Romantic period in particular and the artists that Kehinde is most engaged with in terms of the aesthetic, but also even the texts that are read out in the film and in other projects that have actually led up to this point, does look particularly at Romantic poets, particularly William Wordsworth, and the title, The Prelude or Growth of a Poet's Mind, was something that seemed to be quite seminal in Wordsworth's output, something that he started as a young man in 1799 and didn't actually finish until he was, after his death in 1850. So in every sense, this poem was a journey of a lifetime, and I think that's the tone, the theme, as it were. The other themes within the exhibition is this idea of life's journey, of a kind of global traveller, and the traveller figure, or the wanderer, which was a very particular motif in the Romantic period, particularly associated with men like Byron and Wordsworth, but indeed in Kehinde's film is not only associated with the black figures that he cast in London, but also with women, which again, in and of itself, is quite a departure. So the words that Kehinde uses all the time when he's being interviewed, it's not just this idea of absence and marginalisation and bringing the people like him, as he would say, people like him, full square central to visual culture and the walls of institutions like the National Gallery. But the other words he uses continually is the idea of dignity and grace. And actually he believes firmly and assuredly, and certainly through his work, that everybody deserves to be seen, everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves that moment of grace. And that is really the project that he instigated really from the moment he graduated, when he did his master's degree at Yale University. That's really the thing that he's been looking at most determinedly with his work, is to really redress that imbalance and give people a presence. So I first came across a large-scale exhibition of Kehinde's work at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and it was entitled A New Republic. And I had just gone to the Brooklyn Museum to negotiate a loan of a historical work of art. It happened to be a seascape, and I just came across this exhibition. I knew his work beforehand, I just never had the opportunity to go to the exhibition. And I think the title of this exhibition, which was the biggest representation of Kehinde's work to date, some 20 years worth of work, up to sort of 2015 when it was first launched in the Brooklyn Museum, which really was a retrospective of what Kehinde had been doing to date. But I think the title itself, A New Republic, really indicates that idea of something fresh, new, and this idea of redressing the imbalance of those that would normally be represented in such exhibitions when looking at historical works of art, to a 21st century idea. And the way that Kehinde's work has developed, as I said previously, is not just to focus on North America, on the sitters and the castings that he did in New York City and elsewhere, but also to think of it in a global context. So the exhibition itself did underline a kind of global idea of those who had been marginalised, and including in particular a project called the World Stage, which actually started in China, I think in 2008, 2009, and went on to other places like Delhi, like Tel Aviv, in Paris and so on, just went across different places and cast people from different areas in order to get that sense of a kind of global community, a new republic that wasn't just about the Republic of the United States of America, but perhaps a sort of United States of the world. Now, Kehinde is particularly well known for a certain approach, a certain style of works of art, which I think the paintings in the exhibition are somewhat different. And this painting is the one that really arrested me when I went to the New Republic exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in 2015. It's now owned by them and is in the entrance hall in the museum, so it really is full square central to their displays. It does, as Kehinde has continually done throughout his career, takes as its starting point a historical work of art. For example, on the right-hand side, I don't think I need to tell you, Jacques-Louis David's famous painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. And he takes that as his starting point, and it's very clear what the relationship is between these two paintings on one side to the other. But obviously, this is David's painting is from 1801. There are numerous versions. This is the prime version that's actually in the Chateau de Malmaison, which is associated with Napoleon and his wife Josephine. And indeed, the two paintings actually came together, a Kehinde Wiley and Napoleon Bonaparte conversation a couple of years ago, in order to really underline that kind of journey that this image has done from the moment that David painted it, and it was much admired at the time, both in Britain, France, and elsewhere, and the journey that it itself has gone in terms of the rethinking and the remaking that Kehinde himself has done. Unusually for his portraits up to this point, the figure himself is actually shown in a kind of half-half world of David's and Napoleon's making and his own. The horse is broadly the same, the rocky outcrop is the same. There is also this wonderful golden cloak, there's also the scabbard and the sword that you can see on his hip, but everything else screams contemporary. A bandana, a wristband, the fatigues and the boots all speak of somebody who lives in the contemporary world. And indeed, for the most part, unless he requests the people that are cast in his works to wear something very specifically, for the most part, the people who occupy Kehinde's paintings and his other works of art actually wear their own dress. So there is something at once very contemporary, very fresh, very of the moment with his interpretation of past masters, but equally something that is really, really loaded in terms of the poses, the expressions, these kind of powerful images that have had such a resonance and resonate really across the centuries. You know, why not show somebody who was walking down the streets of Harlem in this kind of way? You know, really elevate them, give them grace, give them dignity, show the way that the power of these kind of conventions have actually worked across the century and why they work. And they do, they work. They're very seductive, they're very attractive. I mean, in Central Hall, we actually have a whole swathe of full-length portraits of the Grand Manner that start with the Renaissance and go through to the 19th century. And the poses and the expressions and the hand gestures are literally running from canvas to canvas. And it's exactly that tradition, that power of convention that Kehinde is playing with. But I think there's a little bit of humour here with this particular painting, because when you look at this kind of very sort of ornate imperial wallpaper or textile that is occupying the background, again, very much a part of his style up until very recently was to have these transformed backgrounds, even if there is much about it that signifies where the original work of art was, is golden sperm literally running between the ornamentation. And that in and of itself suggests works of art that are playing with traditional ideas of masculinity, of power, and so on. And this painting here actually forms part of the Rumours of War series that he began in 2005, and he's been running with really ever since as a very rich scene that he's been mining in terms of the idea of masculinity and race and absence. So this is just a shot of one of the further venues after the New Republic actually started touring. I think it's Indianapolis, I think I'm right in saying. And this indicates very much a change for Kehinde in 2012. Up to that point, he had really focused on young men aged between 18 and 24 or 25. And here he did for the first time in 2012 in the Economy of Grace series that actually looked at women entirely. So the entire series is well of women. And this again was another departure because it actually was a collaboration with Givenchy, and so actually injected the portraits with the idea of haute couture and the idea of glamour, perhaps through the lens of the Western tradition or something that was very much focused on Western ideas of beauty and glamour. But now the sitters themselves, sort of encouraged to own the poses, own the dresses, and evoke their own kind of glamour and fashion in these paintings. And then in the centre there is the sculpture from 2014 called Bound. Again, three busts of women sitters with the hair bound above their heads. And this motif actually reappears in the film that we have at the National Gallery, The Prelude. So moving on to the Rumours of War, the way that it develops, this sort of focus that really has been a part of Kehinde's work from the early years, focusing on men and masculinity and absence and marginalisation, and of course the issues around the police and policing and the relationship to young black men. So the Rumours of War sculpture that was actually unveiled in 2019 in Times Square in New York, and then moved to Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. They have bought the sculpture that sits outside that premises, very powerfully very near Monument Avenue, which, as you probably all know, in Richmond is where the sculptures and memorials celebrating the Confederate generals and leaders, for example, Jefferson Davis, I think that's the monument on the right-hand side, who was president of the Confederate States during the American Civil War. So again, a very powerful juxtaposition of a sculpture of a young black man, and I've heard Kehinde actually say that this is a composite figure of all of those who have been arrested, detained, and indeed have died either in police custody or indeed on the streets of Los Angeles or wherever. This figure represents them. To have it juxtaposed with these monuments of the Confederate States, the leaders, the generals, is very, very powerful. And Kehinde indeed was very keen, at least in an article that I read, I think it was in the New York Times, very keen that this juxtaposition continued, actually, because he felt that it was a provocation, and provocation is a word that he uses all the time. But of course, since the killing of George Floyd in May 2020, many of these sculptures have either been brought down or are being planned to be brought down. So in fact, interestingly, it may be that one of the last equestrian sculptures or figures represented in Monument Avenue may actually be Kehinde's work rather than those from the past, which I think is a very powerful way that time and tide, as it were, move on. Now, Kehinde and I had a discussion about the fact that it's not that black figures are entirely absent from art history. I think the question that Kehinde had about them was, well, if they do appear, how do they appear? And on the whole, they are marginal figures. They might be enslaved people, they might be servants, they might be crew members on board ships, and we'll see an example of that in a moment. But when are they actually the central figure? Now, these examples do exist, and a number of commentators on Kehinde's works has actually suggested that over and above the idea of absence and redressing that absence, that actually part of Kehinde's project, and indeed one could quote other artists in this regard, is to actually focus our attention once again on those representations that do exist but themselves have been marginalized or lost. So, for example, in the Château de Versailles is a wonderful painting by Girodet of Jean-Baptiste Berlet, who himself is a fascinating figure. He was the first deputy of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, who actually sat in the National Convention in Paris, but actually ended up being a leader or a driving force behind the Haitian Revolution, which itself created in, I think, 1804, the Black Republic, the people who had self-liberated themselves, like Berlet, like Toussaint Louverture, who actually, again, interestingly, was one of the highest-ranking generals in the French army before he became the acknowledged leader of the Haitian Revolution. And he is shown here in this engraving from about 1801, 1802, just before his death, clearly in a similar vein to the way that Napoleon was represented in David's work of art. And I show you this, as we're talking about sculpture, this sculpture here, which is actually of General, another high-ranking French officer, I think, again, with Louverture Dumas, who actually, this is Thomas Alexander Dumas, who is, interestingly, the father of Alexander Dumas. You may know the Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo. His father was one of the first black generals in the French army and was actually represented in Paris by this sculpture until it was removed when the Nazis overran Paris in the Second World War. So I'd love to find out whether this sculpture has been destroyed or indeed still exists. So hence the power, I think, and the sort of the game-changing moment when Kehinde Wiley is the first African-American artist to be commissioned to create one of the state portraits, as it were, of a US president, should himself be painting Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States. And again, this is this idea of the presence of these major figures who act as a redress. On some level, they indicate the imbalance, because the Mayor of London actually said the other day that something like only 3% of public sculptures actually represented someone other than a white male figure, by which I mean a memorial of the specific figure rather than a generalised figure of liberty or justice. And amongst those, of course, very few were women and very few were black figures. I mean, we can celebrate, can we not, that the facade of Westminster Abbey now has a sculpture of Martin Luther King, and indeed in Parliament Square and indeed on the South Bank there are representations of I've gone blank now, Nelson Mandela. However, these are relatively recent additions to the London landscape, and I think again the presence of Barack Obama in that run of presidential portraits now in the Smithsonian and in Washington, I think is a tremendously important moment. So very quickly about the technique that Kehinde employs, this idea of casting, actually came very powerfully to him at this sort of seminal moment in his development as an artist when he was at a residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem in New York, where he actually found on the ground a so-called mugshot, which of course is an image with details, height, eye colour, name, address and so on, of a police suspect. That is someone who has been arrested on the street and has now been taken into custody. And the mugshot, he felt sort of dehumanized, made this person, weirdly through the details of his life and his height, and really dehumanized him, made him feel like something to be described rather than something that had his own humanity. And this became a real totem, this mugshot for Kehinde. Indeed, some years later, as you can see from the screen, actually created an oil painting, a portrait of the mugshot itself, in order to give dignity and grace to this figure who I don't think he's ever met. I mean, maybe he has, but this idea of picking his details in his face off the ground in this piece of paper to then really sort of give him a level of dignity and grace within the works of art that he created. And I think the fact that he did an oil painting, again, because oil painting on canvas has a real resonance in terms of art history, it's a luxury object, a high status object, and he felt that he was giving this young man, this person whose details he picked off the street, was giving him dignity, using the medium, using the conventions that would elevate him. And this really has become a major theme, in fact, perhaps a dominant theme in Kehinde's work. And indeed, you know, the idea of giving people back their dignity, of interrogating issues where dignity perhaps has been removed or people have been marginalized in that way, is also seen through a series of works called Smile. I think the first film that he did on this subject matter was in 2001-2002. It was certainly very early in his career. And here again on the screen you can see another version, a digital video from 2016, where the figures have been requested to smile and hold the smile and don't stop smiling, and time goes on, the minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, and you can see the strain and stress of trying to keep that smile in place, the idea of a kind of fake or false happiness that this film sort of suggests is really the fate of the people being represented. And I mention this because it also features in the film Prelude that is at the National Gallery. So it's a theme that Kehinde is certainly returning to on a regular basis. So with this idea of the mugshot and how it's really gone with Kehinde on a journey throughout his career, he then decided to cast people from, in the first instance, the streets of Harlem, which historically speaking has been a black neighborhood. He would approach young men, 18 to 24, 25, and ask them if they wanted to participate with him in the creation of a work of art. And this, he felt, gave the people that he was casting and engaging with agency, that they were determining which images they might do, what kind of poses they might strike. So they were participating in the creation of the work of art rather than simply added in the margins as one would normally see even in paintings at the National Gallery. He would take photographs of them, he would talk to them, they might go back, they might Photoshop, they might change things around, and then he starts painting to create the work of art that you can see on the screen. And indeed, this is the example of the first casting that Kehinde did actually in London for the William Morris Gallery's exhibition, The Yellow Wallpaper, which was responding both to William Morris's wallpaper that were in the collection at the William Morris Gallery, but also the publication, The Yellow Wallpaper, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman of 1892. And here is a whole series of women participating who are, in Kehinde's mind, double marginalised, both as black people and also as women. So to him, this series aligned with Charlotte Perkins Gilman's publication, which talks about being confined and incarcerated in a room covered in wallpaper that she loathed, this yellow wallpaper, is talking about how to find liberation, how to find a way of moving forward with your own life, even though you yourself have had imposed on you those kind of restrictions. And Kehinde is very alive to issues around women's rights, the Me Too movement, as well as, of course, Black Lives Matter, and this juxtaposition of women and black figures within this particular project really does talk about that. The photograph that shows Kehinde approaching someone in Dalston Market basically is she's saying, you're that guy that did Barack Obama's portrait, which is a really lovely thing to capture, that Kehinde himself is known, not so well known in the UK as he is in North America and elsewhere, but certainly increasingly so and justifiably. So then, of course, Kehinde's inspiration, if there was a historical inspiration, it was interestingly the Blue Boy, which is in the collection of the Huntington Art Gallery in San Marino, and he actually went there as a child with his mother and brother because he grew up in Los Angeles. And very recently, Kehinde has had an opportunity to actually respond directly to the Blue Boy, and we have a Blue Boy, the exhibition opening next week. It's coming back. It is back. It's on the wall now for the first time in 100 years. That he himself had an opportunity to respond to this portrait that's been such a central theme of his inspiration. Because when he went to the Huntington to have a look at portraits like the Blue Boy, and the Blue Boy really spoke to him particularly, was as an African-American man with Nigerian heritage, was how does this relate to me? How, when I look at this work of art, what does it say to me? And interestingly, Kehinde continually uses the word aristocratic to describe this and other portraits, despite the fact, of course, that the Blue Boy, as we all know, was not an aristocrat, but most likely Gainsborough's nephew, who assisted him in his studio. And then again, that gets us right back to the power of the grand manner portrait, of poses, of gestures, of expressions that really have the power to make Kehinde stand in front of this portrait as a young boy and say, this is an aristocrat, even though technically this person was not. But it's the language that he really immersed himself in. So here is Kehinde's response to the Blue Boy. It's a celebration of 100 years since Henry Huntington acquired the Blue Boy, and has actually just been acquired by the Huntingtons, so the Kehinde work is now part of their permanent collection. So the last part of this talk, I just want to look at two projects in particular that relate very directly to the project at the National Gallery. These are the Trickster Series of 2017 and In Search of the Miraculous of the same year, which I'll come back to in a moment. So this is actually the first time I think Kehinde really focused on the idea of blackness and the kind of politicized and racialized context of blackness. The trickster is a figure, a sort of animal spirit, or can be an archetypal human being. These are global phenomena, part of global culture, whether it be, for example, Reynard the Fox, and you can see this portrait of Yinka Shonibare, who must be very familiar to people here because he's a British-Nigerian artist. Reynard the Fox, which is a figure from medieval European tradition, and indeed other figures like Hermes, for example, the classical god, all these other sort of trickster figures. But indeed, when I was little, I remember Brer Rabbit, which actually is Brother Rabbit, which relates to the trickster figure of the rabbit, which actually a number of these kind of figures were actually taken to North America from Africa as part of the African diaspora through the transatlantic slave trade. So in fact, the trickster is not just a way of moving around the world and using your wits to get by, but in terms, when it relates, and I've read this quite a lot in terms of the critical response to the Trickster series when it was exhibited in 2017, that the Trickster figure has become part of the way of a kind of coping mechanism for those who had been enslaved, using oral tradition and the figure of the trickster to underline how one might get through this, how one might survive the injustice and the pain of what people were going through at the time. So the trickster figure isn't just this idea of a global figure about shape-shifting animals and humans who kind of, as I say, with their wits, kind of outwit other tricksters or other people, but actually something that does directly relate to the transatlantic slave trade. So again, a very powerful theme to have taken up, and the actual Trickster series focuses particularly on black artists, contemporary artists. And one of the inspirations for this idea of blackness and the kind of tone of the paintings is Goya's black paintings that were produced after the Napoleonic War period, both as a kind of commentary on Goya's distress about the future of humanity, but also his own personal, his physical as well as his mental well-being. So they really came out of a difficult, challenging place, or certainly been interpreted traditionally as such. And the relationship between that series of paintings and Goya in particular, who can forget his disasters of war engravings, the relationship between him and this idea of madness is underscored by the front cover of this publication here that relates to Madness and Civilization by Michel Foucault. And the reason to mention that is that the excerpts from this seminal work actually forms part of Kehinde's film In Search of the Miraculous. And then on the left-hand side, we have Lewis Hyde's publication, The Trickster Made This World, which again was something of inspiration to Kehinde. Lewis Hyde, this is published in 1998, actually mentions figures like Picasso, like Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, but also Frederick Douglass, who many of you will know as this sort of fantastically important figure from the 19th century, who was an abolitionist as well as a social reformer, but also wrote the sort of seminal biographical work about his experiences as an enslaved person, which really has become totemic in terms of that so-called slavery literature. So again, it just underscores the kind of political as well as cultural dimensions of the kind of works, literary works in particular, that Kehinde is looking at. So I just thought it would be fun for you to see the fact that the Ambassadors was actually of inspiration to Kehinde well before he thought of doing a project with the National Gallery. And this, again, the portrait of Rashid Johnson and Sanford Biggers actually forms part of the Trickster series. So both relates to the Ambassadors, but entirely, I think, transformed in his oeuvre. And then the other figure that I wanted to mention as part of the Trickster series was the portrait of Lynette Yademboache, a British artist and writer, a poet. This portrait that actually shows it sort of juxtaposed with these conversation pieces of gentlemen out hunting, and indeed that is the theme of the portrait that Kehinde created of her, has just been acquired by the Yale Centre for British Art and Yale University, which is very neat because, of course, Kehinde is an alumnus of that university. And again, one of my little treks around the National Gallery with Kehinde, he was very struck by the idea of landscape, which gets us into this idea of why he started to focus on landscape and seascapes, is who owns the land, who should be represented in the landscape, who does get represented in the landscape. And his argument would be, certainly in terms of his project, well, it tends to be white people who own the land. And indeed, we were standing in front of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, the famous painting by Thomas Gainsborough from about 1750. And indeed, during this period of the 18th century, you had to have land valued at £100 even to go out hunting. So again, the idea of hunting related to social status. and hence the power of showing not only a black figure holding the gun shooting in the context of 18th century British in particular sporting art, but also the fact that it's a woman. I mean, they're not entirely unknown to show a woman holding a gun or indeed hunting in 18th century portraits, but very, very rare in comparison to those representing men. So we come to the last part of the lecture, which really relates directly to the exhibition here at the National Gallery, and that is we saw the sublime in a kind of psychological sense, the idea of the linking between madness and representation. And what Kehinde was really exploring there, as indeed Foucault and others have done, is the idea of the mad, as they would frame it, being marginalized by a Western society, that they were once integrated into society and then were condemned, as it were, to asylums, or indeed just thought to be on the margins of society. So this is where the Ship of Fools motif really comes into its own as part of Kehinde's project, which again we have a version in the exhibition here at the National Gallery, responding specifically to Hieronymus Bosch's painting of the same subject, itself responding to Sebastian Brandt's publication of 1494 Narrenschiff, or Ship of Fools. And this idea of this is a satire on those who are in the boat, who are drinking and sort of out of control in terms of actually making sure that the ship is on course. So again, we've got this relationship between the idea of ship and society, the good captain, the good pilot, and the bad captains and pilots, and how society goes adrift, as it were, because those who are in control or in command are unable or unwilling or indeed inebriated and therefore cannot look after society. So again, even though we're looking at boats and ships, we are looking at subject matter that actually speaks about policy, about politics, about society, about culture. And again, this is one aspect of what Kehinde was looking at, both in the Stephen Friedman exhibition and also here at the National Gallery. And the title, In Search of the Miraculous, actually relates to a publication by P.D. Ouspensky, who was a Russian philosopher who actually found inspiration in travel, particularly to India, and also the occult. And he himself also inspired Bas Jan Ader, who's the Dutch conceptual artist, who himself was lost at sea as part of an artwork. He wanted to make a solo expedition across the Atlantic in a boat called the Ocean Wave, and he simply disappeared. His boat was found off the coast of Ireland, and he has never been seen since, and of course now proclaimed dead. So this was the sort of inspiration, this kind of foolhardy, this madness of even thinking, a kind of quixotic idea of actually getting into a little boat on your own and going across the Atlantic. Why would you do that? And what Kehinde does here is relate that idea to a journey, a kind of quixotic journey that was actually of his own making. I mean, Bas van Ader decided to do this, juxtaposed with those who are forced to leave, those who are part of forced migration, who are trying to flee climate change, conflict, disasters, earthquakes, whatever. They're leaving because they need to go, and they're going to what they think or what they hope is the promise of a new life and a better life. And so he transforms this idea of Ship of Fools and the idea of madness into, well, why are these people mad? Why are you sort of labeling them as such? Why is it that you think that this is something that really they should just stay where they are? They should just not leave. They should sort themselves out where they are. We'll try and help them, but actually they shouldn't be coming across to us. And I think Kehinde's implicit critique is, well, who's responsible for people who want to leave? Who's responsible for those who cannot stay where they may have been born and brought up? And this is the query really around this theme of maritime art in particular. But equally, maritime art, marine painting, is very much associated certainly in the 18th and 19th centuries, certainly in British, French art, European art, North American art, with the transatlantic slave trade and the black presence in navies and the merchant marine, as it would become known in the 20th century. And there are lots of examples of black figures in seminal works of art from the 18th and Romantic period. For example, Watson and the Shark, which are an actual event that occurred in Havana Harbour. And you can see the figure at the back there of the black sailor. The seminal a manifesto of Romanticism, in fact, on the right-hand side, the Raft of the Medusa. Again, this melding of black and white figures in the desperation to survive. And then, of course, The Slave Ship by Turner, very famous, celebrated, very contentious and challenging work of art, which made its way over to the United States in the 1870s. And then The Gulf Stream by Winslow Homer, a commentary on what had or hadn't happened, indeed mostly hadn't happened, in the aftermath of the American Civil War, with this black figure adrift. So there's lots of examples of black figures who were in navies. For example, at least 10 sailors of African heritage were at the Battle of Trafalgar, much celebrated, only just outside the National Gallery. Indeed, if you look at the pedestal of Nelson's column, you will see in the representation of the Battle of Trafalgar black sailors. So they are present, but they're marginalised, and now Kehinde brings them full square central to his project. So this is the thing that really Kehinde has developed in the project here at the National Gallery. In his film Narrenschiff, he quotes from The Madness and Civilization, the madness of trying to have a better life, the madness of leaving where you lived to who knows into what kind of future. The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's seminal anti-colonial text, is also narrated in Narrenschiff film, and it's very much this that develops into the project here at the National Gallery, and also this aesthetic language of the Romantic period, particularly artists like Turner and indeed Friedrich, as we'll come on to in the last part of this talk. The aesthetic of these paintings, the kind of seductive qualities of them, but also perhaps the challenging and difficult histories that they also represent, is also part of the project. So then finally, really the way that Kehinde's really developed on from the work that he did before in Search of the Miraculous is this new film, The Prelude, and the paintings associated with it, and focusing on Caspar David Friedrich, who alongside Turner and Constable was the radical in landscape art of the period. And I'd love to give a full hour on Friedrich, but alas we can't. But nonetheless, just to indicate that Friedrich is a radical. He himself was very contested by the period that he lived in, the Napoleonic War period. His own native Pomerania, now part of Germany, was continually shifting between different powers. He himself identified very much with the Swedish heritage, and then he lost that to the Prussian heritage, and really was deeply sort of contested and challenged by this forced shift in his own identity. And hence The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is such a famous sort of seminal up there with the Raft of the Medusa, as an image of the Romantic period that was produced just after the Napoleonic War, the Battle of Waterloo being 1815, showing this lone figure looking out across his native terrain. And the figure himself is very mysterious. We don't know if he's experiencing pleasure or pain. We don't know who he is, except to say that the dress that he's wearing, the kind of Jaeger or hunter dress, actually was something that was deemed to be very controversial at the time. And indeed, alongside Altdeutsch, or a very particular traditional German dress, was actually banned at various moments. So in fact, what we think we're looking at is actually really rather challenging in and of itself at the time. But that kind of idea of the sort of single figure looking out over the terrain, as you can see elsewhere in these kind of footage that was shot in Norway as part of the Prelude project, underscores this idea of the wanderer figure, a kind of traveller, not tourist, someone who very much identified with the likes of Lord Byron, who was a kind of misadventurer actually, as a kind of poet, an aristocrat. And we've got 2 examples here of his portraits, and indeed the seminal sort of the poet of nature, William Wordsworth, that we can see in the painting on the right-hand side, which was actually formed part of a preface and an image for a frontispiece on numerous publications of Wordsworth's work. So in fact, that idea of this lone figure with the light hitting his head, almost like an intellectual light, sort of, on his own, contemplating nature in his own kind of sphere, as it were, is very much what the wanderer figure kind of represents. And as I say, a very clear distinction made in the Romantic period between the tourist and the traveller being much more engaged with nature intellectually and spiritually than was the case with the tourist who was simply looking. I should note, however, that the wanderer figure tended to be identified as white and male. I don't know why, actually, Mary Shelley, who of course is the author of Frankenstein, published in 1818, why she herself would not be given that kind of outdoor sublime landscape treatment. Of course, that's not how women were represented at the time. So it shows you this is as much about gender as it may be about white figures as opposed to black figures, which I think is an important element of what Kehinde is doing. So in a sense, what does it mean really to have a black figure on top of this rocky outcrop, looking out across this white terrain, or predominantly white terrain, the fog, the mists, and indeed the sense that you get from Kehinde's film in particular is this overwhelming sense of whiteness, which of course juxtaposed with his focus on blackness in the Trickster series. So what does it mean to have this kind of figure looking out over a landscape of whiteness, the kind of dominance of whiteness in the context of Kehinde's work? Well, I think he is obviously making a political, cultural and social comment on the dominance of whiteness as a political force. The fact that these figures, when you see them in the film in particular, are often struggling against the sort of the aggression almost of the weather, the fact that it kind of takes on its own character as it often overwhelms the figures themselves as they wander through the landscape. But equally, I think what Kehinde is also saying about these figures who perhaps even themselves wonder why they're there, is that they do find this moment to actually pause and play and engage with each other, even though the terrain itself seems so inhospitable. And I think there's clearly a political message there to be made. So in the film, you will see people actually playing the hand games that you often see children playing. I'm reminded of the fact that I recently watched The Colour Purple, the Steven Spielberg film with Whoopi Goldberg, where the sisters, before and after they're actually torn apart, are actually playing this hand game. So this idea of a kind of innocent state, something about the relationship between human beings, which is played out here in Kehinde's film. So this relates, going back to Wordsworth, which we started with the title of the film, The Prelude, but here actually Kehinde is looking at Wordsworth's poem, Ode, Imitations of Immortality, from recollections of early childhood. And what Wordsworth was actually saying in this poem was that actually there was almost like a precondition of childhood, of the soul of a child, even before they were physically born, where they were aligned with nature to such an extent that they could see the divine in nature, that there was a kind of innate spirituality and innocence once they came into the world. And of course, as a child grows up and becomes an adult, they become more aware, they become more conditioned, they become more socialized, and then that's where they lose that connection with the spirituality of one can find in nature. And I think that's something else that Kehinde is very much exploring in the project, is this idea of how one can connect with nature and how one can be at ease with oneself and others in this context. And I shall leave it there. Thank you very much.